Let's start with something that most people in relationships with narcissistic individuals don't even realize they're doing. You're explaining constantly. You're explaining your tone, your intention, your memory, your boundaries, your feelings. You're explaining why you were hurt. You're explaining why something mattered. You're explaining what you meant. And every time you explain, you think you're clarifying. But what you're actually doing is handing them more material. Because here's the truth. A narcissistic person does not enter a conversation to understand you. They enter a conversation to win. So when you explain, you assume you're participating in a good faith dialogue. You assume that if you just find the right combination of words, the right emotional tone, the right evidence, the right timing, they'll finally say, "Oh, I see what you're saying," but that moment rarely comes. Instead, your explanation becomes a tool. They dissect it, they distort it, they weaponize it. They pick one word out of a 10-minute explanation and build an entire counterattack around it. And then you find yourself explaining your explanation. This is how the cycle of disrespect begins, not because you're weak, not because you're unintelligent, but because you are operating from a healthy relational template, and they are not. Narcissistic dynamics feed on over-explanation. The more you talk, the more they interrupt. The more you clarify, the more they accuse you of being defensive. The more evidence you provide, the more they shift the goalposts. It becomes a courtroom where you are always the defendant, and they are always the prosecutor, and somehow also the judge. So the shift, and it is a profound psychological shift, is this: stop explaining. Start declaring. A declaration is not an argument. It is not an invitation to debate. It is not an emotional plea. It is a statement of position. There is a very different energy between, "I just want you to understand why that hurt me," and "that was hurtful." The first invites negotiation. The second establishes reality. When you explain, you're subconsciously asking for validation. When you declare, you're expressing self-trust. And narcissistic individuals are deeply destabilized by self-trust in others. Let's make this practical. Instead of saying, "I didn't mean it like that. What I was trying to say was that I felt overwhelmed because you came home late and didn't call, and it reminded me of last time, and you pause and say calmly, "I felt disrespected." That's it. Notice the difference. There's nothing to twist, nothing to dissect, nothing to debate. It's a closed statement. You are not asking them to agree. You are not asking them to validate. You are stating your internal experience as fact. And if they respond with, "That's ridiculous," or "You're too sensitive," or "Here we go again," the temptation will be to go right back into explanation mode, to prove you're not ridiculous, to prove you're not sensitive, to prove this is not again. That's the trap. Because the moment you re-enter explanation, you've stepped back into their arena. Declarations sound like this: "That doesn't work for me. I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not discussing this further. I disagree. No." Short, clear, regulated, and here's the part that's hard. You will feel rude. You will feel abrupt. You will feel like you're being unfair, especially if you've been conditioned to overfunction in relationships, especially if you've been told you're the reasonable one. But understand this: over-explaining is often a trauma response. It's what people do when they've learned that their reality is frequently challenged. It's a way of trying to preemptively defend against invalidation. You think, "If I just explain it thoroughly enough, they won't be able to twist it." But narcissistic dynamics don't require logic to twist something. They require control. When you declare instead of explain, you remove the supply of chaos. You are no longer feeding the circular argument. You are no longer auditioning for approval. You are not trying to win the case. You are simply stating your boundary and standing in it. And something fascinating happens. At first, they escalate because the old script isn't working. They may accuse you of shutting down. They may say you're cold. They may even intensify the disrespect to provoke you back into the old dance. Stay steady. The goal is not to silence them. The goal is to stabilize yourself. Disrespect loses oxygen when it can't hook into your nervous system. When you stop performing your defense, you stop reinforcing their dominance. And over time, one of two things happens. Either they reduce the overt disrespect because it's no longer rewarding, or the relationship reveals itself clearly as incompatible with your well-being. Both outcomes are clarifying. You are not responsible for convincing someone to treat you well. You are responsible for deciding what you will participate in. So the next time you feel that surge and that urge to prove, justify, clarify, defend, pause, take a breath, and replace the paragraph with a sentence. Replace the emotional plea with a calm declaration. Because when you stop explaining your worth and start declaring your limits, the power dynamic shifts. And that shift begins with this simple truth: you don't owe anyone a defense of your reality. Now, once you understand the power of stopping the over-explanation and starting to declare, we move into something even more practical. Because people always ask, okay, but what exactly do I say? You don't need a dramatic speech. You don't need a perfectly crafted monologue. In fact, the more elaborate it is, the less effective it becomes. What you need is one simple, regulating sentence. That doesn't work for me. Notice what that phrase does. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't insult, it doesn't diagnose, it doesn't shame, it doesn't even demand. It simply states your position. And that is precisely why it's powerful. When you are dealing with a narcissistic person, they expect one of two responses from you: compliance or emotional escalation. Either you give in or you get upset. Both feed the dynamic. Compliance reinforces their control. Emotional escalation gives them drama, and drama gives them energy. But that doesn't work for me does neither. It is calm. It is contained. It is self-referencing. You're not saying you're wrong. You're not saying you're toxic. You're not saying you're a terrible person. You're simply saying, for me, this doesn't work. And that subtle shift matters psychologically, because now the conversation is not about their character. It's not about proving them bad. It's about your boundary. Let's break it down. Imagine they cancel plans at the last minute. Again, or they speak to you in a dismissive tone, or they expect you to rearrange your entire schedule to accommodate them. The old pattern might have sounded like this: why do you always do this? It makes me feel like you don't respect me. I just don't understand why you can't be more considerate. And then what happens? They deflect, they minimize, they counterattack. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. You're making a big deal out of nothing, and suddenly you're defending your emotional legitimacy instead of addressing the behavior. Now imagine instead you say calmly, that doesn't work for me. There's nothing to argue with there. They might try, they may push. What do you mean it doesn't work for you? It's not a big deal. And you repeat, it doesn't work for me. Notice that you are not trying to get them to agree. You are not trying to get them to understand. That's the trap we fall into. The belief that if they just understand our feelings, they'll change. But narcissistic patterns are not rooted in misunderstanding. They're rooted in entitlement. So when you say, that doesn't work for me, you are interrupting entitlement with self-definition. And here's where people struggle. They think a boundary only counts if the other person agrees it's reasonable. That's not true. A boundary is not a negotiation. It is a statement of what you will and will not participate in. You're not asking permission to have a limit. You're expressing one. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you have been conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty, especially if you've been the peacemaker, the empath, the one who smooths things over. This phrase may feel blunt. It may feel almost foreign in your mouth. But discomfort does not mean you're doing something wrong. It often means you're doing something new. The real power of that doesn't work for me is that it keeps you regulated. When you launch into a long explanation, your nervous system gets activated, your voice changes, your heart rate rises, you become emotionally invested in convincing them. And once you're dysregulated, they have leverage. Short, neutral statements protect your nervous system. And let's be honest, some narcissistic individuals will escalate when you start using language like this. They might mock you. They might accuse you of being dramatic. They might say you've changed. You have. You've changed from over-functioning to self-respecting. They may test the boundary, that's predictable, but the key is consistency. If today that doesn't work for me turns into a 20-minute debate tomorrow, the boundary collapses. The power of this phrase is not in saying it once, it's in saying it calmly, repeatedly, and meaning it. And meaning it means you're prepared to follow it with action if necessary. Because a boundary without follow-through is just a suggestion. If something truly doesn't work for you, chronic lateness, disrespectful language, financial irresponsibility, emotional manipulation, and you continue to accept it after stating it doesn't work, the words lose weight. But when your behavior aligns with your statement, something shifts. Either the behavior adjusts or the relationship dynamic reveals its limits. This phrase also protects you from getting pulled into character attacks. When you criticize a narcissistic person directly, they experience it as a threat to their identity. And threats to identity often trigger rage, gaslighting, or withdrawal. But when you keep the focus on yourself, this doesn't work for me, you reduce the likelihood of explosive defensiveness. You're not challenging who they are, you're clarifying who you are, and that clarity is grounding. Over time, this simple sentence builds something incredibly important inside you: self-trust. You start to believe that your discomfort is valid without external validation. You start to realize that you don't need consensus to have standards. Respect begins internally. If you treat your own limits as negotiable, others will too. But when you speak from a place of quiet certainty, people sense it, even those who resist it. You are not responsible for whether they like your boundary. You are responsible for whether you honor it. So the next time you're faced with a demand, a dismissive comment, a manipulative maneuver, or a familiar pattern that leaves you feeling small, resist the urge to argue your case. Resist the urge to persuade. Take a breath, steady your tone, and say simply, "That doesn't work for me." Because the moment you stop trying to win the argument and start honoring your limits, the dynamic changes. And when you mean it, they feel it. Once you begin declaring instead of explaining, and once you anchor yourself in phrases like, "That doesn't work for me," the next escalation in strength is this: "I'm not discussing this further." Now, I want you to notice something. That sentence is not aggressive, it's not loud, it's not dramatic, but psychologically, it is seismic. Because narcissistic dynamics thrive on circularity. The argument is never about resolution. It's about exhaustion. It's about wearing you down. It's about keeping you in the ring long enough that you either surrender, explode, or collapse into self-doubt. Have you ever noticed how the same conversation keeps happening? Different day, same script. You bring up something that bothered you. They deflect. You clarify. They twist, you defend, they escalate, you try to land the plane, and somehow hours later you're apologizing for your tone instead of addressing the issue. That's not communication. That's entrapment. And the reason it works is because you are entering the conversation believing it will eventually make sense. You think if you just stay in it long enough, logic will prevail. But in narcissistic conflict, logic is not the currency. Control is. So when you say calmly, "I'm not discussing this further," you are stepping out of the maze. You are refusing to run another lap. Now, here's the part that's difficult. The first time you say it, they will likely escalate. They may accuse you of shutting down. They may say you're avoiding accountability. They may provoke you with something intentionally inflammatory just to pull you back in. Because the circular argument is a supply line. It gives them attention. It gives them dominance. It gives them the satisfaction of watching you scramble to prove yourself. When you cut off the discussion, you cut off the supply. But this only works if you mean it. If you say, "I'm not discussing this further," and then 5 minutes later you're back in the debate, the boundary dissolves. It becomes a bluff. And narcissistic individuals are very skilled at detecting bluffs. This is not about stonewalling. It's not about refusing healthy dialogue. In a healthy relationship, you absolutely revisit issues. You repair, you listen, you collaborate. But this is different. This is about recognizing when a conversation has shifted from resolution to domination. There is a moment in these exchanges, and you can feel it, when the energy changes. Your nervous system tightens, the points start repeating, the tone becomes sharp. You're no longer being heard, you're being cornered. That's the moment. That's when you say evenly, I'm not discussing this further. And then you stop. You don't justify why. You don't tack on a paragraph explaining your reasoning. You don't defend the decision. Because the second you explain why you're ending the discussion, you've reopened it. Silence after the boundary is part of the boundary. This can feel terrifying at first, especially if you're used to keeping the peace, especially if you're afraid of their reaction. But understand something. Staying in a circular argument does not actually prevent escalation. It just prolongs it. When you disengage, you are protecting your psychological energy. And this is crucial. Narcissistic dynamics often operate by depleting you. The goal isn't necessarily to win the specific point. The goal is to exhaust you into compliance. When you are tired enough, confused enough, worn down enough, you're more likely to say, fine, whatever. I'm not discussing this further, interrupts that depletion cycle. It communicates something very powerful. I am not available for endless debate. Notice again the theme. These phrases are not attacks. They are not diagnoses. They are not insults. They are statements of availability. That doesn't work for me. I disagree. I'm not discussing this further. You are defining what you will engage in, and over time that changes how you see yourself. Because here's what often happens in narcissistic relationships. You start to believe that you are the difficult one, the dramatic one, the argumentative one. You internalize the idea that if you were just calmer, clearer, more patient, the conversations would go better. But the problem isn't your communication skill. The problem is the game itself. You cannot win a circular argument designed to have no end. Ending the discussion is not losing. It's refusing to play. Now, will this guarantee that they never disrespect you again? No phrase can guarantee that. But what it does guarantee is that you will no longer participate in your own erosion. And that's the shift. When they realize the loop no longer works, one of two things happens. They may reduce the behavior because it's no longer effective, or they may intensify temporarily to test whether you'll fold. Consistency is everything here. Calm repetition. No theatrics, no lectures. I'm not discussing this further. And then you physically disengage if needed. You leave the room, you end the call, you change the subject, you redirect your attention. The boundary must be behavioral, not just verbal. At first, it will feel unnatural. You may lie awake replaying the unfinished conversation in your mind. You may feel the pull to go back and clarify one more point. Don't. The urge to re-engage is often anxiety, not necessity. You are allowed to end a conversation that is going nowhere. You are allowed to stop defending yourself. You are allowed to preserve your energy. Respect begins the moment you decide that your peace is not up for endless negotiation. So the next time the conversation starts circling, the accusations start looping, the tone shifts from discussion to domination, steady yourself. Lower your voice instead of raising it, and say calmly and clearly, I'm not discussing this further. Because the most powerful move in a rigged game is to walk away. As you begin stepping out of circular arguments and refusing to over-explain, something else becomes very clear. Narcissistic dynamics are fueled by the need to control perception. It's not just about controlling what happens. It's about controlling what is true, controlling the narrative, controlling how reality is defined. And this is where one of the most disarming phrases comes in, you're entitled to your opinion. Now, at first glance, that may sound passive. It may even sound like surrender. But psychologically, it is the opposite. It is detachment without submission. Because when you say, you're entitled to your opinion, you are doing something radical. You are stepping out of the fight for reality. Think about how many arguments spiral because you are trying to get them to agree with your version of events. That's not what happened. You said this. You promised that. You can't just rewrite it. And they counter with denial, minimization, distortion. They tell you your memory is flawed. Your perception is skewed. Your emotions are irrational. And before you know it, you're not just defending a boundary, you're defending your sanity. That's how gaslighting gains power. Not because you're weak, but because you believe reality should be shared. In healthy relationships, it usually is. Two people may remember things slightly differently, but there's a willingness to find common ground. There's a mutual respect for each other's internal experience. But in narcissistic dynamics, agreement equals control. If they can get you to doubt your perception, they regain dominance. So the debate over what really happened becomes endless. This is where you're entitled to your opinion changes the terrain. You are not agreeing. You are not conceding. You are not validating a distortion. You are simply refusing to engage in the tug of war over truth. It sounds like this. They say, you're overreacting. That never happened. You respond calmly. You're entitled to your opinion. Notice what you didn't do. You didn't argue. You didn't present evidence. You didn't pull out screenshots, timestamps, or emotional transcripts. You didn't try to force alignment. You detached. And detachment is destabilizing to someone who relies on engagement for control. This phrase communicates something subtle but powerful. I know what I experienced. I don't need you to confirm it. That is self-trust in action. And for many people in these relationships, self-trust has been eroded over time. You've been questioned so often that you start second-guessing yourself automatically. You rehearse conversations in your head. You wonder if maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you're remembering it wrong. So when you say you're entitled to your opinion, what you're really saying internally is, I am entitled to mine. And you don't need to say that second part out loud. That's the beauty of it. The power is quiet. Now, let's be clear. This phrase is not meant to be sarcastic. It's not meant to be delivered with an eye roll or a sharp tone, because then it becomes another spark in the fire. It must be regulated, neutral, almost steady to the point of boring. The goal is not to win. The goal is to disengage. And here's what often happens next. They push harder. So you're just going to ignore what I'm saying? You can't handle the truth. You always have to be right. Again, the pull is to defend, to prove you're not ignoring, to show you can handle the truth, to demonstrate flexibility, pause, repeat if necessary. You're entitled to your opinion. What you are refusing to do is participate in the rewriting of your reality. This is especially powerful when dealing with projection. Narcissistic individuals often attribute their own behaviors or motives to you. They may accuse you of being controlling when they are the ones micromanaging. They may accuse you of being selfish when they consistently center themselves. They may accuse you of being dishonest when they are hiding things. If you argue each accusation point by point, you're back in the maze. But when you respond with calm detachment, you stop absorbing the projection. You don't have to correct every distortion. Let me say that again because it's important. You do not have to correct every distortion. You can let them have their opinion without letting it define you. This doesn't mean you tolerate abuse. If the behavior crosses into disrespect or harm, boundaries and consequences still apply. But when it comes to perception battles, those endless debates about who meant what, who intended what, who remembers what, sometimes the most powerful move is opting out. Because here's the deeper truth. The desperate need to be understood can keep you trapped. We all want to be seen accurately. That's human. But when you're trying to extract accurate understanding from someone committed to distortion, you will exhaust yourself. You're entitled to your opinion is an act of emotional conservation. It says, I will not drain myself trying to convert you. Over time, this builds a quiet confidence. You stop seeking agreement as proof of legitimacy. You start recognizing that your internal experience stands on its own. And that shift changes everything. Because when someone realizes they can't pull you into a debate over your own reality, they lose one of their primary leverage points. You are no longer fighting to be right. You are standing in what you know, and there is an unshakable strength in that. So the next time they challenge your perception, minimize your feelings, or attempt to rewrite the narrative, resist the urge to prove your case, take a breath, ground yourself, and say evenly, you're entitled to your opinion. Because when you stop fighting for agreement, you start reclaiming your truth.
By the time you reach this point where you're no longer over-explaining, no longer debating endlessly, no longer fighting to control the narrative, you begin to understand something critical about boundaries. Words alone are not enough. Because here's the hard truth. A boundary without a consequence is just a suggestion. And narcissistic personalities are very good at testing suggestions. That's why this next phrase matters so much. I will leave if this continues. Now notice the structure of that sentence. It is not a threat. It is not an ultimatum delivered in rage. It is not, if you don't change right now, I'm done with you. It is conditional, calm, and self-focused. I will leave if this continues. You are not trying to control them. You are not telling them what they must do. You are stating what you will do. That distinction changes everything. In narcissistic dynamics, control is currency. If you say, you need to stop talking to me like that, the focus shifts to their behavior, and they may resist simply because they don't want to feel controlled. But when you say, I will leave if this continues, the focus is on your choice. You are not managing them. You are managing yourself. And that is power. Let's be clear about something, though. This phrase only works if you are prepared to follow through. If you say it repeatedly and never act on it, it becomes noise. And once a narcissistic person realizes there is no action behind your words, the disrespect often escalates. Consistency builds credibility. Imagine this scenario. They raise their voice. They start belittling. They cross into mocking or contempt. Instead of matching their intensity or trying to reason through it, you say evenly, if you continue speaking to me like this, I will leave. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. Now, you watch. If the behavior stops, the boundary has been acknowledged. If it continues, you calmly follow through. You leave the room, you end the call, you exit the environment. You do not slam doors. You do not deliver a speech on the way out. You do not add 10 paragraphs of justification. You simply act. And here's why this matters psychologically. Narcissistic individuals often rely on the belief that you won't actually withdraw, that you will stay, that you will tolerate, that you will endure the escalation because you care, because you hope, because you want resolution. When you demonstrate that your presence is conditional on respect, the dynamic shifts. Respect is no longer optional. Now I want to address something important. For some of you, the idea of leaving, even temporarily, feels terrifying. You may fear retaliation, you may fear abandonment, you may fear being labeled dramatic or unstable. That fear is real, especially if you've been in a long-term dynamic where walking away was punished emotionally. But staying in a space where you are consistently disrespected carries its own cost. It erodes self-worth slowly, almost invisibly. I will leave if this continues is not about ending the relationship in that moment. It is about ending the interaction when it becomes harmful. And over time, something profound happens inside you. You begin to trust yourself. You begin to believe that you will protect your own dignity, that self-trust radiates differently. You speak differently. You carry yourself differently. There is less desperation in your tone because you are no longer bargaining for basic respect. Now, will this phrase guarantee that a narcissistic person transforms? No. No sentence has that kind of magic. What it does guarantee is that you stop participating in your own diminishment. Sometimes when you begin enforcing consequences, the other person escalates briefly. They test, they push harder. They may accuse you of overreacting or being controlling. But remember, you are not controlling them. You are controlling access to you. Access is earned through behavior. This phrase also exposes something very quickly. If someone values the relationship, they adjust when they see you are serious. If someone values control more than connection, they resist. Either way, clarity increases. And clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is freeing. Boundaries with consequences are not cruel. They are protective. They create structure. They define what kind of treatment is acceptable. And without that structure, disrespect often becomes normalized. You are not required to stay in a conversation that is degrading you. You are not required to absorb verbal aggression in the name of keeping the peace. You are allowed to remove yourself. And the beauty of this phrase is its simplicity. No theatrics, no moral lecture, just calm accountability. If this continues, I will leave. It places responsibility exactly where it belongs, on behavior. Over time, when you consistently follow through, the message becomes clear. You are not available for mistreatment, not because you are superior, not because you are rigid, but because you value your own psychological safety, and that is not negotiable. So the next time the tone shifts, the disrespect creeps in, the pattern starts replaying itself. Don't argue, don't plead, don't over-explain, steady your voice, hold your ground, and say clearly, if this continues, I will leave. Because the moment you are willing to walk away from disrespect, you stop being controlled by it. As you begin to understand the power of consequences, of removing yourself rather than trying to overpower the moment, we come to something even more direct. Because sometimes the issue isn't subtle manipulation or circular logic. Sometimes it's tone, it's contempt, it's the way the words are delivered. And in those moments, one sentence can reset the entire interaction. I don't accept being spoken to that way. Notice what this does. It does not diagnose them. It does not label them a narcissist. It does not accuse them of abuse. It addresses the behavior, specifically the behavior, and it centers your standard. I don't accept being spoken to that way. That's not an attack. It's a line. One of the defining features of narcissistic dynamics is normalization of disrespect. It starts small, a sarcastic jab, a dismissive sigh, a mocking tone, a public put-down disguised as humor. And if it goes unchecked, it escalates. Because behavior that is tolerated becomes permission. Many people in these relationships tell themselves, it's not that bad, or they're just stressed, or I shouldn't be so sensitive. So the first time it happens, you brush it off. The second time, you feel the sting but say nothing. By the 10th time, it has become the communication style. And slowly, your nervous system adapts to something it should never adapt to. When you say, I don't accept being spoken to that way, you interrupt that normalization. You're not arguing the content of what they said. You're addressing the manner. Let's say they say something like, are you really that clueless? Or you always mess things up? Or they roll their eyes while you're speaking. The old pattern might have been to defend yourself. I'm not clueless. I was just trying to help, or to counterattack, or to shut down. Instead, you say evenly, I don't accept being spoken to that way. Now here's the key. Your tone must match the boundary. If it comes out as a yell, it turns into escalation. If it comes out shaky and apologetic, it loses authority. The power is in calm firmness. This phrase is powerful because it makes the disrespect visible. Contempt thrives in ambiguity. It thrives when it can be dismissed as a joke, a misunderstanding, or oversensitivity. When you name it as unacceptable, you remove the ambiguity. And again, expect resistance. They may say, oh, come on, I was just joking. Or, you're too sensitive. Or, this is why it's so hard to talk to you. That's predictable. The goal is to push you back into self-doubt. Don't take the bait. You don't need to argue about whether it was a joke. You don't need to prove your sensitivity is reasonable. You simply repeat, if necessary, I don't accept being spoken to that way. Notice what you're not doing. You're not saying, you're disrespectful. That attacks identity and invites defensiveness. You're saying, I don't accept this behavior. That focuses on your boundary. This distinction is crucial because narcissistic personalities are often highly reactive to perceived criticism. But a boundary stated as a personal standard is harder to spin into an attack. It also does something internally. It reinforces that your dignity is not conditional on someone else's mood. You are not required to absorb someone's bad day. You are not required to tolerate contempt because they're frustrated. Disrespect is not a communication style you have to accommodate. And here's something deeper. Many people who find themselves in these dynamics were raised in environments where disrespect was normalized early. Maybe sarcasm was constant. Maybe yelling was common. Maybe emotional invalidation was routine. So your threshold for what feels normal may already be skewed. That's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to recalibrate. When you say, I don't accept being spoken to that way, you are recalibrating in real time. You are teaching people how to engage with you. Now let's connect this to the earlier points. If the disrespect continues after you've named it, that's when the consequence comes in. If this continues, I will leave. The phrases build on each other. First, you identify the behavior. Then you define the boundary. Then, if necessary, you enforce it. It's a sequence. And over time, something shifts in you. You stop waiting for them to decide whether you deserve respect. You decide. That internal shift is transformative. Because disrespect often chips away at self-worth quietly. You may not even notice how much you've adjusted to avoid provoking it. You speak more carefully. You shrink your opinions. You hesitate before sharing something important. But when you start naming unacceptable behavior in the moment, you reclaim space. You speak more clearly. You hold eye contact. Your body language changes. You're no longer bracing for impact. Will this make a narcissistic person suddenly warm and empathetic? Not necessarily, but it will make one thing very clear. You are not a safe target for contempt, and that clarity matters, because people test what they can get away with. And when they learn they cannot get away with belittling you, the dynamic either adjusts or reveals itself fully. Either outcome gives you information. Respect is not something you beg for. It's something you require through consistent behavior. So the next time the tone shifts, the sarcasm cuts, the contempt sneaks in under the guise of humor, pause. Feel your feet on the ground. Keep your voice steady and say clearly, I don't accept being spoken to that way. Because the moment you name disrespect, you stop participating in it. Now, after everything we've talked about, declaring instead of explaining, refusing circular arguments, detaching from perception battles, enforcing consequences, naming disrespect, we arrive at something that feels almost too simple to be powerful. Silence. Strategic, intentional, regulated silence. And I want to be very clear here. This is not silent treatment. It's not punishment. It's not withdrawal designed to manipulate. It is the refusal to feed a dynamic that thrives on your reaction. Narcissistic interactions run on fuel, and that fuel is emotional energy. It can be positive or negative: admiration, anger, tears, defensiveness, pleading, frustration. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're engaged. When you react, they feel impact. When they feel impact, they feel control. That's why sometimes the most destabilizing thing you can do is nothing. You don't argue, you don't correct, you don't defend, you don't escalate. You simply don't respond. Now, this is incredibly difficult because when someone misrepresents you, provokes you, or says something blatantly unfair, your nervous system activates. You want to set the record straight. You want to stand up for yourself. You want justice. That urge is human, but in certain dynamics, responding is exactly what keeps the cycle alive. Imagine they say something provocative. You're always so dramatic, or nobody else would put up with you, or they try to bait you with a half-truth designed to trigger you. The old pattern might have been immediate engagement. That's not true. What do you mean always? That's such an unfair thing to say, and now you're in it. But silence disrupts the script. You look at them. You remain neutral. Maybe you nod slightly. Maybe you simply redirect your attention. No sarcasm, no eye roll, no visible rage, just calm disengagement. What happens next is revealing. Often they escalate briefly. They repeat it louder. They add something sharper because they're trying to get a rise out of you. They're trying to confirm that they still have access to your emotional center. Stay steady. Silence communicates something words cannot. I am not available for this. And here's what makes it so powerful. When you argue, you validate the premise that the comment deserves debate. When you respond to bait, you validate the bait. When you defend against every jab, you signal that the jab landed. Silence denies validation. Now, I want to emphasize something important. This is not about suppressing your feelings. It's about choosing when and where to express them. Silence in the moment doesn't mean you never address the issue. It means you don't address it in a reactive state or in a space designed to distort it. Silence is containment. It protects your nervous system from unnecessary escalation. And over time, this does something remarkable. You begin to feel less hooked. The comments that once would have sent you spiraling begin to lose their charge, not because they're acceptable, but because you no longer hand them power through reaction. There's also something else happening psychologically. Narcissistic individuals often rely on predictability. They know which buttons to push. They know which phrases get you emotional. When you stop responding predictably, the dynamic becomes unstable. For them, you are no longer playing your assigned role. That unpredictability can feel empowering. You realize you don't have to respond to every provocation. You don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. And let's be honest, not every comment deserves your energy. Energy is finite. If you spend it correcting every distortion, fighting every accusation, reacting to every jab, you will be exhausted. And exhaustion makes boundaries harder to maintain. Silence conserves strength. Now, some people worry that silence looks weak, that if they don't respond, it means the other person won. But silence is not surrender. It is restraint. It is control over your own impulse. There is immense power in someone who cannot be easily provoked. And this connects to everything we've discussed. Silence often follows a boundary. You say, I don't accept being spoken to that way. If they continue, you disengage. You say, I'm not discussing this further. And then you stop discussing it. No final word, no last jab, no dramatic exit speech, just quiet. And in that quiet, something shifts inside you. You realize that your peace does not require their agreement. Your dignity does not require their validation. You stop performing for the reaction. And here's the deeper truth. When you stop reacting, you start observing. You begin to see patterns more clearly. You notice how often the provocation is intentional. You notice how quickly the tone shifts when you don't respond. You gather data instead of losing energy. That awareness strengthens you. Silence is not about shrinking. It's about choosing your ground. It's understanding that not every fight is yours to take on. And when someone realizes they can no longer control you through emotional provocation, something changes. Either the behavior loses intensity because it's no longer effective, or it becomes so obvious that you can no longer ignore what the relationship truly is. Both outcomes bring clarity. So the next time the bait is thrown, the insult is disguised as humor, the accusation is meant to spark you. Pause. Feel your breath. Let the moment stretch. And say nothing. Because sometimes the strongest statement you can make is the one you don't speak. After all of this, the declaring, the disengaging, the boundaries, the consequences, the silence, we come to the smallest word in the English language. 2 letters, 1 syllable. And for so many people in narcissistic dynamics, it is the hardest word to say. No, not I don't think so, not maybe later, not let me see, not I'll try, just no. Now I want you to really sit with that. Because when you've been in a relationship where your needs were minimized, your reality questioned, your boundaries pushed, no can feel dangerous. It can feel selfish. It can feel like you're about to trigger conflict. And that fear is not irrational. Many of you learned very quickly that saying no led to backlash, to sulking, to rage, to guilt trips, to emotional withdrawal. So you adapted, you softened your refusals, you wrapped them in explanations, you turned them into negotiations. But here's what happens when no disappears from your vocabulary. Access becomes unlimited. And when access is unlimited, respect erodes. Narcissistic personalities often test limits, not because they're confused, but because they're assessing how far they can go. Each time you override your own discomfort to avoid conflict, the boundary shifts a little further. And over time, you find yourself saying yes to things that exhaust you, diminish you, or contradict your values. Saying no interrupts that pattern at its core. It is not loud. It is not aggressive. It does not require a speech. It sounds like this. Can you cancel your plans to help me with this right now? No. Why are you making such a big deal about this? I'm not, and no. I need you to stop talking to that person. No. Now notice what happens next. The instinct, especially if you're conflict avoidant, is to follow the no with a cushion. No, because I'm really tired and I've had a long week and that explanation may be true. But the more you justify, the more room there is for negotiation. But you weren't too tired last week. You always have an excuse. If you really cared, you would. And suddenly your no is on trial. A clean no leaves very little to argue with. It doesn't invite persuasion. It doesn't invite debate. It doesn't invite character attacks. It simply defines a limit. Now, this doesn't mean you never explain. In healthy relationships, context matters. But in narcissistic dynamics where explanations are often weaponized, the power of a simple no cannot be overstated because no is an act of self-definition. It says, I am allowed to choose. For many people in these relationships, choice has slowly narrowed. You begin to feel obligated, responsible for their emotions, responsible for their comfort, responsible for preventing their anger. But you are not responsible for managing someone else's entitlement. And here's the uncomfortable part. When you start saying no consistently, you may see an increase in pushback. You may be called selfish, cold, uncooperative, difficult. That is often the reaction of someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Stay steady. The purpose of no is not to change their opinion of you. It is to change your relationship with yourself. When you say no and follow through, something strengthens internally. You begin to trust that you will not abandon yourself to keep the peace. You begin to feel less resentful because resentment often grows in the space where you said yes but meant no. And that resentment can poison you quietly. No prevents that buildup. It also simplifies interactions. Instead of complex emotional negotiations, there is clarity. Instead of passive-aggressive compliance, there is directness. And clarity is powerful. Now let's connect this to everything else we've discussed. You declare instead of explain. You disengage from circular arguments. You detach from perception battles. You enforce consequences. You name disrespect. You use silence strategically. All of that culminates here. No is the foundation beneath all of it. Without no, the other phrases lose strength. That doesn't work for me as an expanded version of no. I'm not discussing this further is no to circularity. I will leave if this continues is no to escalation. I don't accept being spoken to that way is no to contempt. At its core, the entire shift is about reclaiming your ability to say no without apology. And here's the deeper truth. When you say no calmly, without anger, without over-explaining, without trembling, you communicate something very clear. I am not afraid of your reaction. That does not mean you feel no fear. It means you are no longer ruled by it. And that changes the dynamic in profound ways. Because control relies on predictability. If they know you will eventually give in, they keep pushing. But when no actually means no, the pushing loses purpose. Will this guarantee they never disrespect you again? Nothing guarantees that, but it guarantees that you will no longer cooperate with your own diminishment. And that is the real shift. The smallest word can carry the greatest power. So the next time you feel that familiar pressure, the guilt, the manipulation, the expectation that you will bend, take a breath, feel your spine straighten, let your voice settle, and say it, no. Because the moment you can say no without apology is the moment you stop negotiating your worth.